One of my first ever jobs came with a final salary pension scheme. I knew these schemes were generous, so it was a bit of a no-brainer to join it. And besides, it was still very early in my career, so I didn't really know much better. Final salary equals good idea. That's all I knew, so I signed up. But very shortly afterwards, they closed their final salary pension scheme to new entrants, and it changed to a less generous career average defined scheme. Again, I was very young, didn't really care. That's for later in life, I thought. My strategy for pensions at the time was really quite simple. Quickly get up to speed by speaking to a few people that I knew that knew their stuff around pensions, at least way more than I did at the time. And then if I liked what I heard, then sign up to it and forget about it. A few years later, I moved on from this to a bank and left this pension scheme at the same time. As in, I obviously stopped contributing to it. I was still a member of the pension plan, of course, but I stopped contributing to it. This meant my pension money would stay within that plan, and I would have to keep a record of it so that when it came down to draw down in 30, 40 years time, I knew who to contact. But, and here's the other but, I had only been in the scheme for a few short years, as in the years were obviously 365 days long. They weren't actually shorter years. But anyway, I guess you knew that and weren't actually confused by the term shorter year. And now I've gone on and digressed. Anyway, back to the point. So I'd only been in this pension scheme a few short years. And as it was one of my first jobs, I was on a fairly low salary at the time. And so the defined annual benefit I'd be getting in roughly 4 decades time wasn't really forecast to be much at all. In fact, it was a little under £2,000 a year. That's all. So essentially nothing. And remember, I mentioned I didn't really care at the time. Not when I joined the plan and not when I left that job. Fast forward a decade and then some, and now I had amassed a number of different pension plans that I wanted to bring together. I had learned that keeping all these pension plans with the original scheme providers wasn't really optimal for me, because the visibility of the funds that all that money was invested in, their associated fees and all that jazz wasn't as clear as it could be. And of course, having things all over the place made things even more opaque. So I started bringing it all together under one roof, into a place where I could pick the funds I wanted it all invested in, where there wasn't a risk of mismanagement, where I could control the amount of eroding that any fees could do to my pension pot. And I would do this, of course, like you've heard me say in other videos, put this in index tracking funds. So funds that track the index and charge a very low fee for doing that. So I did just that. Most of the transfers were simple decisions, because final salary schemes had largely gone the way of the dinosaur. And apart from that job that I talked about earlier where I joined a final salary scheme, the other transfers were fairly simple decisions. For that final salary one, however, it was a different situation. Transfers out were possible, of course. And with final salary pensions, the clue's in the name. I couldn't, of course, cash out of the pension part of that equation. It is still a pension, of course, but I could cash out of the final salary element of it. Transfer those funds to a SIPP, a self-invested pension plan that I can manage. And from the title of this video, you already know the punchline. I did transfer out, but what you don't know yet is why. I transferred out for the following reasons. I'm still a few decades away from drawing down from a pension, and pension funds in general I think are massively vulnerable. They are a massive funds pool which I think firstly are not optimally managed, and I think they're primed to be attacked from future governments who are looking for easy sources of income to fill their deficits, or from more riskier private equity investments, or just from other poor practices that don't get noticed until things really go wrong. And even if none of that turns out to be true, there has been a general trend of pension funds being in deficit over the last few decades. Another reason is I don't generally like pensions. There you go, I said it. And actually, it's probably not the first time you've heard this if you've watched my older videos. Even if you ignore final salary pension schemes, I don't really like pensions, unless you're getting an employer match. For me, there's not a lot of upside, but there's a lot of downside risk. For me, it's like placing some money in a bottle and throwing it into the ocean, knowing that you've thrown it into an ocean jet stream that will bring it back to your shores in 30 to 40 years time, but not knowing if your bottle will make it back and hoping it doesn't get smashed to pieces on its way, whilst also trusting that it will accumulate other treasures on its route. Okay, so that last part doesn't completely work. But anyway you cut it, there are huge risks I'm taking on. Now I like risk, I like betting, but sensible bets. Not 30 to 40 year bets where essentially everything is outside of my control. I also don't like that these large pension plans are somewhat opaque in the amount of fees they charge and that eats into your eventual returns. And of course the annual benefit I was going to get from this pension plan was fairly low as well. And knowing I could transfer it out of this final salary scheme and together with all my other pension cash meant that I could manage it myself. And not only would it be simpler to oversee and manage, but also I knew I would have access to many more investment options. And with my focus on index funds, I knew I could minimize the fees I was paying, thereby maximizing my returns and the amount of growth I actually get to keep. I mean, when it comes down to it, I essentially had two options. Keep it in its current form in that final salary pension scheme, and hopefully if everything goes right, look forward to just under £2,000 a year when I reach retirement age, which isn't really a lot. Or two, get a valuation now and see how I could take charge of those funds myself and put that money to work for me in what I felt was a better, more optimized way. So the first thing I did was write to the pension plan trustees and ask about the process. It turned out, like everything, this needed to be done in writing, of course, and I had to specifically request the transfer value of my pension. When this came through, I was encouraged to take professional advice and avoid falling prey to scammers, which is always solid advice. I was provided with a transfer out form, which essentially asked for all the relevant personal details and details of this pension scheme that I wanted to transfer to, because as I mentioned before, it's still a pension. I couldn't just withdraw it as cash. All I was essentially doing was moving it from one pension scheme to one that was managed by me. I was also given a deadline by which to complete this form as submitted, as after this date, the transfer value that I was given couldn't be guaranteed, and the process would effectively have to be restarted. For me, they gave me 3 months, which was plenty of time. If no form was submitted by this deadline, then your pension scheme, the funds in it, would remain exactly as they are. No changes would be made. I promptly completed the form and submitted it, and had the pension value transferred over to my SIPP within weeks. And as it moves over in cash, I also then promptly invested that cash into the funds that fits my preferred allocation. And that's where it sits to this day, growing with the markets into which it's invested, with low fees and, to my mind, lower risk. Are you considering doing something similar or have done it previously? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget, if you like videos on money stuff and personal finance, then hit the subscribe button. I'll see you on the next one.